The golden sunlight of a late Wyoming summer afternoon caught in Ruby Caldwell's chestnut hair as she knelt among the vibrant wildflowers dotting the open field. She hadn't noticed when she crossed onto someone else's property, following the colorful blooms that had beckoned her from the dusty road. Her slender fingers worked quickly, gathering blue lupins and bright yellow black-eyed Susans into a makeshift bouquet, her mind far from thoughts of trespassing. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her freeze, clutching the flowers to the bodice of her simple blue dress. A tall figure on horseback appeared at the edge of the meadow, silhouetted against the setting sun. Ruby scrambled to her feet, ready to apologize and flee if necessary. "Those flowers seem to like you, as much as you like them," a deep voice called out as the rider approached. The man pulled his horse to a stop a respectful distance away. "They suit you just fine." It was 1878, and Ruby Caldwell had arrived in Sweetwater Springs, Wyoming territory, just 3 days prior, still mourning the death of her father and seeking a fresh start in the West. At 22, she had traveled alone from Philadelphia with little more than a trunk of possessions and determination to make a new life for herself. The cowboy dismounted with easy grace, pushing his hat back to reveal a face bronzed by the sun, with eyes the color of the clear Wyoming sky. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders beneath a worn leather vest. "I'm terribly sorry," Ruby said, finding her voice. "I didn't realize I had wandered onto private property." "No harm done," he replied, offering a slight smile that softened his weathered features. "Vaughn Hollis," he introduced himself with a slight bow. "This is my land, though I've never been much for keeping people from enjoying what nature provides." "Ruby Caldwell," she replied, extending her hand in the proper Eastern manner. "I've only just arrived in town." Vaughn took her hand briefly, his calloused palm rough against her skin. "You're staying with Martha Jenkins, I reckon?" News travels fast in Sweetwater Springs. Ruby nodded, surprised. "Yes, she's letting a room to me until I find more permanent arrangements." "Martha's good people," Vaughn said, glancing at the bouquet in her hand. "You've got quite an eye for the prettiest blooms. Most folks around here don't take much notice of wildflowers. Where I'm from, flowers like these are cultivated in gardens," Ruby explained. "To see them growing wild, free for anyone to enjoy. It's quite wonderful." Vaughn's expression changed slightly, a curious light entering his eyes. "You're welcome to pick as many as you like, Miss Caldwell. My cattle don't much care for the flowers anyway." A gust of wind blew across the meadow, sending loose strands of Ruby's hair dancing around her face. She tucked them back, suddenly conscious of her disheveled appearance after her afternoon wandering. "I should be getting back before Mrs. Jenkins begins to worry," she said, though something in her wished to linger in the meadow with this intriguing cowboy. "Allow me to escort you," Vaughn offered, gathering his horse's reins. "Town's a fair walk from here, and the sun won't stay up much longer." Ruby hesitated only briefly before nodding her acceptance. As they walked together toward town, the horse following dutifully behind, Ruby found herself stealing glances at her companion. There was something compelling about Vaughn Hollis, a quiet strength and dignity that set him apart from the other men she had encountered in her brief time in Sweetwater Springs. "What brings you all the way to Wyoming territory, Miss Caldwell?" Vaughn asked as they followed the winding dirt path toward town. Ruby considered how much to share with this stranger. "My father passed away this spring. There was nothing keeping me in Philadelphia anymore." "I'm sorry for your loss," Vaughn said, his voice genuine. "It takes courage to travel so far alone." "Or desperation," Ruby replied with unexpected candor. "The West seemed like a place where one might start anew." Vaughn nodded thoughtfully. "That it is. Many come here seeking something fortune, freedom, forgetting." "And which were you seeking, Mr. Hollis?" Ruby asked before she could stop herself. A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Perhaps a bit of all three, Miss Caldwell." As they approached the edge of town, Ruby found herself reluctant for their walk to end. Something about Vaughn Hollis intrigued her. Perhaps it was the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, or how he spoke to her as an equal rather than as a fragile woman who needed protection. "Thank you for the escort, Mr. Hollis," Ruby said as they reached Martha Jenkins' modest two-story house on the edge of town. "And for your generosity regarding the flowers." "My pleasure, Miss Caldwell," Vaughn replied, touching the brim of his hat. "Perhaps we'll meet again sometime." "Perhaps," Ruby agreed, a smile playing on her lips as she turned toward the house, the bouquet of wildflowers still clutched in her hand. Martha Jenkins, a plump, gray-haired widow in her 60s, was waiting on the porch, her keen eyes missing nothing as Ruby approached. "I see you've met Vaughn Hollis," Martha remarked as Ruby climbed the steps. "Yes, I inadvertently trespassed on his property while picking these," Ruby admitted, holding up the wildflowers. Martha's eyes twinkled. "Vaughn's a good man, one of the finest in these parts. Came here about 8 years ago with nothing but determination and worked himself to the bone to build that ranch of his. He seems kind," Ruby offered, not wanting to reveal too much of her interest. "He is that," Martha agreed. "And he could use a bit of kindness himself after everything he's been through." She didn't elaborate further, leaving Ruby curious about what trials Vaughn Hollis might have faced. That evening, as Ruby arranged the wildflowers in a simple glass jar on her bedside table, she found herself thinking of the tall cowboy with the sky-blue eyes and wondering if their paths would indeed cross again. The following morning, Ruby ventured into town to continue her search for employment. Sweetwater Springs was a growing settlement with a main street lined with wooden storefronts, a general store, a bank, 2 saloons, a small hotel, and various other businesses. Ruby had come with some savings, but she knew she would need to find work soon. As she passed the newspaper office, a sign in the window caught her eye. "Assistant needed, inquire within." Without hesitation, Ruby straightened her bonnet and entered the small building. The interior smelled of ink and paper, and a large printing press dominated the back wall. A middle-aged man with spectacles perched on his nose looked up from a desk covered in papers. "Can I help you, miss?" he asked. "I've come about the position," Ruby replied, nodding toward the sign.
"I'm Ruby Caldwell."
"I recently arrived from Philadelphia." The man looked surprised but stood and extended his hand. "Howard Perkins, editor and owner of the Sweetwater Springs Sentinel. You have experience with newspapers, Miss Caldwell?" "My father was a professor of literature," Ruby explained. "I assisted him with research and editing his academic papers. I'm well-read, quick to learn, and have excellent penmanship." Howard considered her for a moment. "Can you operate a printing press?" "No, but I'm certain I could learn," Ruby said confidently. "It's not typical work for a lady," Howard warned. Ruby met his gaze steadily. "I'm not looking for typical work, Mr. Perkins. I'm looking for meaningful work." A smile crept across Howard's face. "Well said, Miss Caldwell. The position involves assisting with typesetting, proofreading, some basic bookkeeping, and occasionally gathering news items from around town. The hours can be irregular when we're going to press." "Still interested?" "Very much so," Ruby confirmed. "Very well. Let's give it a trial run for 2 weeks. If we suit each other, we'll make it permanent." Howard named a modest but fair wage, and Ruby agreed immediately. "When would you like me to start?" she asked. "How about right now?" Howard replied, gesturing to a stack of handwritten pages. "These need to be proofread for tomorrow's edition." Ruby removed her bonnet and got to work, excitement bubbling within her. This job would not only provide income, but also give her insight into her new community. By midday, she had corrected several grammatical errors and clarified some confusing passages, impressing Howard with her attention to detail. "You have a natural talent for this, Miss Caldwell," he commented as they broke for lunch. "Take an hour to refresh yourself. When you return, I'll show you the basics of typesetting." As Ruby stepped outside, blinking in the bright sunlight, she nearly collided with a solid figure on the boardwalk. "Miss Caldwell," Vaughn Hollis said, steadying her with a gentle hand on her arm. "We meet again." Ruby felt a flush rise to her cheeks at his touch. "Mr. Hollis." "Yes, it seems we do." Vaughn gestured to the newspaper office. "Visiting Howard?" "Actually, I've just been hired as his assistant," Ruby explained, unable to hide her pride. "Today is my first day." Something like admiration flickered in Vaughn's eyes. "Congratulations. Howard's a good man, if a bit particular about his newspaper." "I've noticed," Ruby said with a small laugh. "But I appreciate someone who values precision." Vaughn nodded toward the hotel restaurant across the street. "I was just heading for some lunch. Would you care to join me, Miss Caldwell? To celebrate your new position?" Ruby hesitated only briefly. In Philadelphia, a single woman dining with a man she barely knew would be considered scandalous. But this was the West, where conventions seemed more flexible. "Thank you, Mr. Hollis. I would like that," she decided. The hotel restaurant was simple but clean, with checkered tablecloths and windows that looked out onto the bustling main street. A few heads turned as Vaughn and Ruby entered, curious glances following them to a table by the window. "You've caused quite a stir in our little town," Vaughn commented as they sat down. "It's not often we get new residents, especially ones as—" He paused, seeming to search for the right word. "As Eastern," Ruby suggested with a slight smile. "I was going to say refined," Vaughn corrected, a hint of warmth in his voice. The waitress, a young woman with blonde hair piled atop her head, approached their table with a knowing smile. "Afternoon, Vaughn. Who's your friend?" "Daisy. This is Miss Ruby Caldwell, recently of Philadelphia." Miss Caldwell, Daisy Miller, runs the finest dining establishment in Sweetwater Springs. "The only dining establishment," Daisy corrected with a laugh. "Welcome to our town, Miss Caldwell. What'll you have today?" "The stew's fresh." They ordered, and as Daisy departed, Ruby found herself the subject of Vaughn's thoughtful gaze. "You mentioned your father was a professor," he said. "May I ask what brought you specifically to Sweetwater Springs? There are larger towns with more opportunities for someone with your education." Ruby traced the pattern on the tablecloth with her fingertip. "I wanted somewhere peaceful. Somewhere I could build something for myself without the weight of the past pressing down on me." She looked up at him. "That probably sounds foolish." "Not at all," Vaughn replied softly. "I understand better than you might think." There was something in his tone that made Ruby curious, but before she could inquire further, Daisy returned with their meals. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as they ate the newspaper, the upcoming Harvest Festival, the quirks of Sweetwater Springs residents. Ruby found herself laughing more than she had in months. Vaughn Hollis possessed a dry wit beneath his reserved exterior, and he seemed genuinely interested in her opinions and experiences. By the time they finished their meal, Ruby felt as though she'd known him much longer than a day. "I should get back to the newspaper," she said reluctantly as Vaughn paid for their meals despite her protests. "Of course," Vaughn agreed, rising to pull out her chair. "I have business at the bank myself." As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, Ruby noticed several townspeople watching them with undisguised interest. She realized that her lunch with Vaughn would likely become a topic of conversation throughout Sweetwater Springs. "I fear I may have compromised your reputation, Mr. Hollis," Ruby said, only half joking. Vaughn's eyes crinkled at the corners. "My reputation can withstand a lunch with a respectable lady, Miss Caldwell. It's yours I'd be concerned about." "Well, as the newest employee of the town newspaper, I suppose I should get accustomed to being talked about rather than doing the talking," Ruby replied lightly. "You'll do fine," Vaughn assured her. "Folks around here judge by actions more than gossip. Speaking of which—" He hesitated. "The Harvest Festival is Saturday next. If you'd like to see more of local life, it's quite the event. There's dancing in the evening." Ruby felt a flutter of anticipation. "Are you inviting me, Mr. Hollis?" "I suppose I am," Vaughn admitted, a hint of color appearing beneath his tan skin. "Then I accept," Ruby said, surprising herself with her boldness. "I look forward to it." With a tip of his hat and a smile that Ruby found herself wanting to see again, Vaughn departed toward the bank. Ruby returned to the newspaper office, her heart lighter than it had been in many months. The rest of the week passed in a blur of activity as Ruby learned the intricacies of the newspaper business. Howard proved to be a patient teacher, and Ruby absorbed his lessons eagerly. By Friday, she had mastered basic typesetting and had even written a small piece about the upcoming Harvest Festival that Howard deemed worthy of publication. "You have a way with words, Miss Caldwell," he remarked as they prepared the Saturday edition. "Have you considered writing more extensively for the paper?" "I hadn't, but I'd certainly be interested," Ruby replied, pleased by his approval. "Perhaps you could prepare something about the festival from a newcomer's perspective," Howard suggested. "It might offer a fresh view of traditions we locals take for granted." Ruby agreed enthusiastically, already formulating ideas in her mind. The prospect of attending the festival with Vaughn Hollis added an extra layer of anticipation to the assignment. Saturday dawned clear and crisp, with the first hints of autumn in the air. Ruby spent the morning helping Howard distribute the latest edition of the Sentinel, then returned to Martha's house to prepare for the festival. Martha found her standing before the small mirror in her room, fretting over her appearance. Ruby had chosen her best dress, a deep green that complemented her fair complexion and chestnut hair. It was fashionable by Eastern standards but seemed overly formal for a country festival. "You look lovely, dear," Martha assured her, adjusting a pin in Ruby's upswept hair. "Vaughn won't be able to take his eyes off you." Ruby blushed. "Is it that obvious?" Martha chuckled. "Only to someone who's been watching young love bloom for half a century. Vaughn Hollis is a good man, Ruby, but he carries sorrows he doesn't speak of." "What happened to him?" Ruby asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Martha sighed, sitting on the edge of Ruby's bed. "It's not my story to tell in full, but Vaughn came west after the war. He was married once, back east. They had a child." Ruby's heart constricted. "What happened to them?" "Influenza, from what I understand. Took both his wife and daughter in the winter of '69. Vaughn never speaks of them, but Martha Wheeler over at the general store remembers him mentioning them when he first arrived. He was like a man half dead himself back then." Ruby thought of the man she'd come to know, reserved but kind, with a quiet strength about him. How much pain lay beneath that composed exterior. "He's built himself a good life here," Martha continued. "That ranch of his is one of the most prosperous in the county now. But a man needs more than land and cattle to be truly content." A knock at the front door interrupted their conversation. Martha patted Ruby's hand. "That'll be your escort. Remember, dear, sometimes the hearts that have been broken are the ones most worthy of being mended." With those words echoing in her mind, Ruby descended the stairs to find Vaughn waiting in the front parlor. He had traded his usual work clothes for a clean white shirt, dark vest, and polished boots. His hair was neatly combed, though a rebellious lock had already fallen across his forehead. He looked up as Ruby entered, and the admiration in his eyes made her breath catch. "Miss Caldwell," he said, rising to his feet. "You look beautiful." "Thank you, Mr. Hollis," Ruby replied, suddenly shy. "You look quite handsome yourself." Martha bustled in with a knowing smile. "Now don't keep her out too late, Vaughn. Though I suspect you two young people won't lack for chaperones, what with the whole town attending." Vaughn offered his arm to Ruby, and the warmth of him beside her sent a pleasant shiver through her body as they stepped out into the golden afternoon light. A wagon waited outside, hitched to two handsome bay horses. "I thought this might be more comfortable than riding double," Vaughn explained, helping Ruby up to the cushioned seat. "It's perfect," she assured him, arranging her skirts as he climbed up beside her. The Harvest Festival was held in a large meadow at the edge of town, with wooden platforms erected for dancing and long tables laden with food. Colorful bunting and paper lanterns adorned the trees, and a small band was setting up their instruments on a raised platform. As they arrived, Ruby was struck by the sense of community evident in the gathering. Everyone from gray-haired elders to toddling children had come together to celebrate the bounty of the season. Several people called out greetings to Vaughn, their curious gazes lingering on Ruby. "Come," Vaughn said, helping her down from the wagon. "Let me introduce you around." The next hour passed in a whirl of introductions and conversations. Ruby met the town doctor and his wife, the blacksmith and his large brood of children, the schoolteacher, the banker, and countless farmers and ranchers from the surrounding area. Everyone welcomed her warmly, if with undisguised curiosity about her relationship with the usually solitary Vaughn Hollis. "You're quite popular," Ruby observed as they finally found a moment alone, cups of sweet apple cider in hand. Vaughn looked uncomfortable with the observation. "People respect hard work around here. That's all." "It's more than that," Ruby insisted gently. "They genuinely like you." Vaughn's expression softened. "Well, I'm certainly improving my standing in town by escorting the prettiest new resident to the festival." Ruby felt her cheeks warm at the compliment. Before she could respond, the band struck up a lively tune, and couples began gathering for a dance. "Would you do me the honor?" Vaughn asked, extending his hand. "I should warn you that I'm only familiar with Eastern dances," Ruby said as she placed her hand in his. "Don't worry," Vaughn replied with a smile that transformed his features. "I'm a patient teacher." The dance was a simple reel, more energetic than the sedate waltzes Ruby knew from Philadelphia society. She followed Vaughn's lead, laughing as he twirled her through the patterns. His strong hands guided her with surprising gentleness, and when their eyes met during a pause in the movement, Ruby felt a connection deeper than mere attraction. As evening fell, lanterns were lit around the meadow, casting a warm glow over the festivities. Ruby and Vaughn danced several more times, interspersed with conversations with various townspeople. Ruby took mental notes for her newspaper article, but increasingly found herself distracted by her companion. During a break in the dancing, Vaughn led her to a quieter spot beneath a large oak tree. The sounds of music and laughter continued in the background as they stood in companionable silence, watching the stars emerge in the vast Wyoming sky. "It's beautiful here," Ruby said softly. "So open and free." "That's what drew me to this place," Vaughn admitted. "The endless possibility of it. A man can breathe out here, create something from nothing." "Is that what you've done with your ranch?" Ruby asked. Vaughn nodded, pride evident in his voice. 8 years ago, it was just overgrazed land nobody wanted. Now, it's one of the most productive cattle operations in the county. "That's remarkable," Ruby said sincerely. "You should be proud." "I am," Vaughn replied. "But lately I've been wondering if it's enough." His voice had dropped lower, and Ruby had to lean closer to hear him over the music. "What do you mean?" she prompted gently. Vaughn turned to face her fully, his expression vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "A man can have land, cattle, a good house. But what does it matter if there's no one to share it with?" Ruby's heart quickened at his words. "Vaughn," she said, using his given name for the first time. "Martha told me about your wife and daughter." "I'm so sorry." Pain flashed across his features, but he didn't pull away. "Elizabeth and little Alice. It was a long time ago." "Time doesn't always heal such wounds completely," Ruby said softly, thinking of her own father's passing. "No," Vaughn agreed. "But sometimes life offers unexpected second chances." His gaze held hers, filled with tentative hope that made Ruby's breath catch. Before either could speak again, a commotion from the direction of the dance area drew their attention. Raised voices carried through the night air, followed by the unmistakable sound of a fist connecting with flesh. "Stay here," Vaughn instructed, already moving toward the disturbance. Ruby hesitated only briefly before following him. A small crowd had gathered around two men, one she recognized as the bartender from the Golden Nugget Saloon, the other a rough-looking stranger with a week's growth of beard and bloodshot eyes. "I said the lady doesn't want to dance with you, Jenkins," the bartender was saying, fists raised defensively. The man called Jenkins swayed on his feet, clearly intoxicated. "No woman turns me down," he slurred, reaching for a young woman who shrank back in fear. Vaughn stepped forward, his posture relaxed but alert. "That's enough. You're disturbing the festivities." Jenkins squinted at Vaughn. "Who the hell are you to tell me what to do?" "Vaughn Hollis," he replied calmly. "And this is a family gathering. I suggest you head back to town and sleep it off." Something shifted in Jenkins' bleary eyes. "Hollis? The rancher?" A nasty grin spread across his face. "Heard you were getting cozy with the new gal in town. Eastern ladies slumming it with cowboys now." Ruby saw Vaughn's shoulders tense, but his voice remained steady. "You're drunk, Jenkins. Go home before you say something you'll regret." Jenkins' gaze shifted to Ruby, standing at the edge of the crowd. "That her? Pretty little thing. Maybe after I'm done with you, I'll show her what a real man." He never finished the sentence. Vaughn's fist connected with his jaw in a swift, controlled movement that sent Jenkins sprawling to the ground. The crowd gasped, then fell silent as Vaughn stood over the fallen man. "Apologize to the lady," Vaughn demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Jenkins spat blood onto the grass. For a moment, it seemed he might continue the fight, but something in Vaughn's steady gaze made him reconsider. "Sorry, miss," he muttered, struggling to his feet. "No offense meant." "Sheriff Davis," Vaughn called to a tall man who had pushed his way through the crowd. "Mr. Jenkins here is leaving the festival early. Perhaps you could escort him to town." The sheriff nodded grimly, taking Jenkins by the arm. "Come on, son. You've worn out your welcome." As they led Jenkins away, the tension in the air gradually dissipated. The band struck up another tune, and the dancing resumed, though people continued to cast curious glances at Vaughn and Ruby. Vaughn turned to Ruby, concern evident in his eyes. "I apologize for that unpleasantness. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Ruby assured him, though her heart was still racing from the confrontation.
"Are you?"
"Your hand." Vaughn glanced down at his knuckles, already beginning to bruise. "It's nothing." Ruby reached for his hand anyway, examining it gently. "You defended my honor quite thoroughly, Mr. Hollis." "No man speaks about a lady that way," Vaughn said firmly. "Especially not." He stopped himself. "Especially not what?" Ruby prompted, still holding his hand in both of hers. Vaughn met her gaze directly. "Especially not a lady I've come to care for a great deal, in a very short time." The simple honesty of his words touched Ruby deeply. Standing there beneath the stars, with the music playing softly in the background and Vaughn looking at her as though she were precious, Ruby felt a certainty she had never experienced before. "I've come to care for you too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Vaughn's eyes darkened with emotion. His free hand came up to gently touch her cheek. "Ruby," he said, her name sounding like a caress on his lips. "May I call on you properly?" "Court you as you deserve to be courted?" "Yes," Ruby replied without hesitation. "I would like that very much." The smile that transformed Vaughn's face made him look years younger, erasing the lines of solitude and quiet sorrow that had marked his features when they first met. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "we should rejoin the festivities before the good people of Sweetwater Springs have even more to gossip about." Ruby laughed, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Let them gossip," she said boldly, slipping her arm through his. "I'm rather enjoying giving them something to talk about." The remainder of the evening passed in a golden haze of dancing, laughter, and shared glances filled with new understanding. When Vaughn finally drove Ruby home well past midnight, the stars seemed to shine brighter than she had ever seen them. At Martha's front porch, Vaughn helped Ruby down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Thank you for a wonderful evening," Ruby said, reluctant for their time together to end. "The pleasure was mine," Vaughn replied, his voice low and warm in the quiet night. "May I see you tomorrow? Perhaps you might like to see the ranch in daylight." "I would love that," Ruby said, her heart full of new possibilities. Vaughn hesitated, then leaned forward slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. Instead, Ruby tilted her face up to his, and their lips met in a gentle kiss that held the promise of deeper passion. When they parted, Vaughn's eyes were dark with emotion. "Good night, Ruby," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Good night, Vaughn," she replied, reluctantly stepping back toward the door. Ruby watched from the porch as Vaughn drove away, her fingers touching her lips where his had been moments before. She had come west seeking a new beginning, never imagining she might find not only a purpose, but perhaps a heart to match her own. The days that followed took on a rhythm and richness Ruby had never expected to find in the Wyoming territory. Mornings were spent at the newspaper office, where she thrived under Howard Perkins' guidance, gradually taking on more responsibility for the weekly edition. Her article about the Harvest Festival from a newcomer's perspective had been well received, leading Howard to encourage her to write a regular column about life in Sweetwater Springs. Afternoons and evenings increasingly belonged to Vaughn. True to his word, he began courting her properly, driving her to church on Sundays, taking her on picnics along the river that wound through his property, escorting her to community gatherings. With each passing day, Ruby's feelings for him deepened, as did her understanding of the complex, honorable man beneath the quiet exterior. 3 weeks after the Harvest Festival, Vaughn invited Ruby to Sunday dinner at his ranch house. It would be her first time seeing his home, and she found herself both excited and nervous as his wagon crested a small rise, revealing the property below. "It's beautiful," Ruby breathed, taking in the sight of the substantial 2-story house nestled among cottonwood trees. A large barn and several outbuildings stood nearby, and cattle grazed in the distant pastures. "It's not fancy," Vaughn said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice, "but it's solid." "Like its owner," Ruby replied with a warm smile. The house proved to be even more impressive inside. The furnishings were simple but well-crafted, with large windows allowing light to fill the rooms. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, and bookshelves lined one wall filled, Ruby noted with pleasure, with an impressive collection of volumes. "You're a reader," she observed, running her fingers along the leather spines. "My father was a schoolteacher back in Virginia," Vaughn explained. "He believed education was the most valuable thing a man could possess." "A wise man," Ruby said. "My father felt the same way. He taught me Latin and Greek alongside my brothers." "I'd like to have known him," Vaughn said sincerely. "He would have liked you," Ruby replied, touched by the sentiment. Vaughn showed her through the house with the pride of a man who had built something significant with his own hands. The kitchen was spacious and modern, with a large cast-iron stove and ample cupboards. "Mrs. Wilkins from town comes 3 times a week to cook and clean," Vaughn explained. "The rest of the time, I manage on my own." "You've created a real home here," Ruby said as they returned to the main room. Vaughn's expression grew serious. "It's taken years to build, but lately I've realized something was missing." He took her hands in his. "Ruby, these past weeks with you have been the happiest I've known in a very long time." Ruby's heart quickened at the intensity in his blue eyes. "For me as well," she admitted. "I know it hasn't been long," Vaughn continued, "but when something feels right, when it feels meant to be, I don't see the sense in waiting." He drew a deep breath. "I find myself thinking of you from morning till night, wondering what you're doing, hoping to make you smile. When I'm with you, everything seems brighter somehow. Ruby felt tears pricking at her eyes. Vaughn, I don't want to rush you, he said quickly. I know you came west to build a new life for yourself, and I respect that independence. But I wanted you to know that my feelings for you are serious. I care for you deeply, Ruby Caldwell. And I for you, Ruby replied, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. I never expected to find someone like you when I came west. You've shown me kindness, respect, and understanding from our first meeting. Vaughn's thumb traced gentle patterns on the back of her hand. We both know what it is to lose people we love. Perhaps that makes us value what we've found all the more. Ruby nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The losses they had each endured had shaped them, made them recognize the precious nature of connection when it appeared. Their dinner that afternoon was simple but delicious roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and an apple pie that Mrs. Wilkins had prepared before departing for her own Sunday observances. Throughout the meal, Ruby found herself imagining many such dinners shared in this warm kitchen, imagining a life built together within these walls. After they had eaten, Vaughn suggested a walk to see more of the property. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they strolled toward a small rise overlooking the ranch, Vaughn's hand warm and secure around Ruby's. When I first came here, this land was overgrazed and neglected, Vaughn explained as they looked out over the vast expanse. The previous owner had let it go to ruin. Everyone told me I was a fool to buy it. But you saw its potential, Ruby observed. Vaughn nodded. Sometimes you have to look beneath the surface, see what something could become with care and patience. His gaze turned to her, full of meaning. The same is true of people, I think. And dreams. They stood in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun begin its descent toward the distant mountains. Ruby felt a profound sense of peace wash over her, a feeling that she was exactly where she was meant to be. There's something I'd like to show you, Vaughn said eventually, leading her toward a small grove of trees a short distance from the house. As they approached, Ruby saw a small fenced area beneath the trees. With a start, she realized it was a tiny cemetery, lovingly maintained. 2 headstones stood side by side within the enclosure. Vaughn opened the gate, his expression solemn but composed. I wanted you to meet them, he said quietly. Ruby's throat tightened with emotion as she read the inscriptions. Elizabeth and Hollis, beloved wife and mother, 1845-1869. Alice Marie Hollis, our angel, 1867-1869. They're part of who I am, Vaughn said, his voice steady despite the pain Ruby knew this must cause him. I couldn't move forward without acknowledging them, honoring their memory. Ruby placed her hand gently on his arm. Thank you for sharing this with me, for trusting me with their memory. Vaughn covered her hand with his own. Elizabeth would have liked you. She was strong-willed, determined, much like you. A small, sad smile touched his lips. And Alice. She was just beginning to show her personality when the fever took them both. She had her mother's laugh. Tell me about them, Ruby encouraged softly. If you want to. For the next hour, they sat on a bench near the small cemetery, and Vaughn spoke of his first wife and daughter stories he had kept locked away for years. He told Ruby of meeting Elizabeth at a church social in Virginia, of their hasty wedding before he left to fight in the war, of his return to find their home destroyed and their families scattered. We decided to come west, start fresh, Vaughn explained. We were happy here, despite the hardships. When Alice came along, it felt like all the suffering of the war years had been worth it, to create something so perfect. Ruby listened, her heart aching for the young family torn apart by illness, for the man who had carried this grief alone for so many years. After I lost them, I threw myself into building the ranch, Vaughn continued. I thought if I worked hard enough, I wouldn't have time to feel the pain. But a man can't outrun grief forever. No, Ruby agreed softly, thinking of her own father. But he can learn to carry it differently in time. Vaughn's eyes met hers, filled with understanding.
Yes.
And sometimes, when he least expects it, he finds a reason to look toward the future again rather than dwelling in the past. The weight of his words hung between them, full of unspoken meaning. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the peaceful cemetery, Vaughn took Ruby's hands in his. "I never thought I would feel this way again," he said, his voice low and intense. "I never thought I would want to. But you, Ruby Caldwell, you make me believe in second chances." Ruby felt tears well in her eyes. "I believe in them too," she whispered. "And I believe what we've found together is rare and precious." Vaughn raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "We should head back before it gets dark," he said, though his eyes conveyed much more than his simple words. As they walked hand in hand toward the house, Ruby felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them. Vaughn had shared his deepest pain, his most private grief, and in doing so had offered her his trust completely. The weeks that followed deepened their connection in countless ways. Ruby continued to thrive at the newspaper, earning the respect of the community with her thoughtful writing and tireless work ethic. Howard Perkins had begun to rely on her increasingly, even sending her to cover important events in neighboring settlements when he was busy with the printing. Vaughn courted her with a quiet steadfastness that touched her deeply. Unlike some of the flashier suitors she had known in Philadelphia, he didn't seek to impress her with grand gestures or elaborate gifts. Instead, he showed his feelings through consistent kindness, through listening attentively when she spoke, through small, thoughtful actions that revealed how closely he observed what brought her joy. When Ruby mentioned missing her father's library, Vaughn presented her with a rare volume of poetry he had ordered from Denver. When she admired the wildflowers that still bloomed in protected valleys despite the advancing autumn, he brought her fresh bouquets to brighten her desk at the newspaper office. The people of Sweetwater Springs watched their courtship with approval and, in some cases, relief. Many had worried about the solitary rancher who had built a successful operation but seemed to find little joy in his achievements. Now they saw him smile more often, linger in town rather than hurrying back to his empty house, engage in community events with genuine interest rather than dutiful participation. "You've brought him back to life," Martha Jenkins remarked one evening as Ruby prepared for another dinner at Vaughn's ranch. "The whole town can see it." Ruby blushed at the older woman's frank assessment. "He's done the same for me. I came west feeling so adrift, so uncertain of my place in the world. Vaughn has helped me find my footing here." Martha nodded approvingly. "When it's right, you know it. No need to wait years to recognize what's plain as day." As October gave way to November, the weather turned sharply colder. The first snow dusted the mountains, and the citizens of Sweetwater Springs began preparations for the coming winter. Ruby found herself increasingly concerned about the approaching season, knowing that travel between town and Vaughn's ranch would become more difficult as the snows deepened. One crisp Saturday morning, Vaughn arrived at Martha's house earlier than expected. Ruby was helping Martha with the weekly baking, her hands dusted with flour when she heard his familiar knock. "Vaughn," she greeted him with surprise, hastily wiping her hands on her apron. "I wasn't expecting you until this afternoon." His eyes were bright with excitement, though he maintained his usual composed demeanor. "I was hoping you might accompany me on an errand this morning. There's something I'd like your opinion on." "Of course," Ruby agreed, curious about what could have brought him to town so early. "Let me just change quickly." Martha shooed her upstairs with a knowing smile. "Don't worry about the baking, dear. I've been managing on my own for years." 20 minutes later, Ruby was seated beside Vaughn in his wagon, heading not toward his ranch as she had expected, but toward the western edge of town. "Where are we going?" she asked, pulling her woolen shawl closer against the November chill. "You'll see," Vaughn replied, a hint of mystery in his smile. They turned onto a quiet side street lined with modest homes, stopping before a small but charming house set back from the road. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and mature trees sheltered the yard. "What do you think?" Vaughn asked, watching her reaction closely. Ruby studied the house, noting its well-maintained appearance and pleasant setting. "It's lovely. Whose home is this?" "No one's at the moment," Vaughn replied. "Old Mr. Peterson passed away last spring, and his children moved to California years ago. It's been standing empty since then." He hesitated, then added, "I've been thinking of buying it." Ruby turned to him in surprise. "But you have your ranch house." "The ranch is a good 30-minute ride from town in good weather, longer in winter," Vaughn explained. "I've been thinking it would be practical to have a place in town as well, for those times when business keeps me here late or weather makes travel difficult." It made sense, yet Ruby sensed there was more to this decision than practical considerations. "Would you like to see inside?" Vaughn asked. "I have the key from Mr. Wilson at the bank." The interior of the house was as charming as its exterior, 4 comfortable rooms downstairs, including a cozy parlor with a fireplace and 3 bedrooms upstairs. The kitchen was smaller than the one at the ranch, but well appointed, with a view of what would be a lovely garden in spring. "It needs some fresh paint and minor repairs," Vaughn noted as they explored, "but the structure is sound. Mr. Peterson was a carpenter by trade and built this place to last." Ruby could easily imagine the house brought back to life: curtains at the windows, books on the shelves, a rocking chair by the fireplace. "It has wonderful potential," she agreed. They ended their tour in the parlor, where morning sunlight streamed through the east-facing windows. Vaughn stood in the center of the room, suddenly appearing uncharacteristically nervous. "Ruby," he began, his voice more serious than it had been during their tour, "I didn't bring you here just to ask your opinion as a friend." Ruby's heart began to beat faster as Vaughn took her hands in his. "The truth is," he continued, "I've been thinking about our future, about what I want that future to look like." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "And in every version I can imagine, you're there beside me." "Vaughn," Ruby whispered, her voice catching with emotion. "I know it hasn't been long," he acknowledged, echoing his words from weeks earlier. "But some things, when they're right, don't need the validation of time. I love you, Ruby Caldwell. I love your strength, your intelligence, your kindness. I love how you've embraced this community, how you see beauty in places others overlook. I love that you understand loss, but haven't let it harden your heart." Tears welled in Ruby's eyes as Vaughn continued, his voice growing more confident with each word. "I want to build a life with you, days at the ranch, evenings by the fire, perhaps children someday if you wish it. I want to see you gathering wildflowers in our fields for years to come." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. "Ruby Caldwell, would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" The box opened to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a single pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. It was elegant and understated, perfectly suited to Ruby's taste. "It was my grandmother's," Vaughn explained softly. "Elizabeth had her own ring, which is kept safe for Alice, should she have lived. This one has been waiting for a second chance at love." Ruby's tears spilled over as the full meaning of his gesture washed over her. Vaughn wasn't just asking her to share his future, he was honoring his past while embracing the possibility of new happiness. "Yes," she whispered, her voice strong despite her tears. "Yes, Vaughn Hollis, I will marry you." Joy transformed Vaughn's features as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he gathered her into his arms, his lips finding hers in a kiss that spoke of deep emotion and promised devotion. Ruby melted against him, her heart so full she thought it might burst. When they finally parted, Vaughn gestured to the house around them. "I thought perhaps this could be our town home close to your work at the newspaper, convenient for winter stays, a place to entertain friends." "And the ranch?" Ruby asked, already certain of his answer. "Our main home," Vaughn confirmed. If that suits you. I know it's a simpler life than you might have had in Philadelphia, but Ruby silenced him with another kiss. It's exactly the life I want, she assured him when they parted. With exactly the man I want. The news of their engagement spread through Sweetwater Springs like wildfire. By supper time, it seemed every resident knew that the town's newest citizen had captured the heart of one of its most respected ranchers. Well wishes poured in from all directions, along with some good-natured teasing about the speed of their courtship. When you know, Martha declared firmly to anyone who expressed surprise. And these two know. Ruby and Vaughn decided on a December wedding, before the worst of winter set in. With just 6 weeks to prepare, Ruby threw herself into arrangements with characteristic energy, balancing wedding plans with her continuing work at the newspaper. Howard Perkins was among the first to congratulate them, though his enthusiasm was tempered with concern about losing his valuable assistant. I suppose you'll be giving up the newspaper once you married, he said ruefully, when Ruby shared her news. Not at all, Ruby replied firmly. Unless you wish to replace me, of course. Howard looked surprised. Most women leave employment when they marry, especially to someone as well situated as Hollis. Vaughn and I have discussed it, Ruby explained. He understands how much my work means to me, and he supports my desire to continue. Of course, I may need to adjust my hours somewhat, particularly in winter when travel between the ranch and town is difficult. Howard's expression cleared. Well, that's a relief. You've become indispensable around here, Miss Caldwell, or soon-to-be Mrs. Hollis. The sound of her future name sent a pleasant shiver through Ruby. Mrs. Hollis. It felt right, as though she had been waiting all her life to claim it. The weeks leading up to the wedding passed in a blur of activity. Ruby wrote to her brothers in Philadelphia, sharing her happiness and inviting them to attend if they could make the journey. Though neither could travel such a distance on short notice, their letters of congratulation warmed her heart. Her oldest brother, Richard, promised to visit in the spring, eager to meet the man who had won his sister's heart so completely. Meanwhile, Vaughn purchased the Peterson house and set about making the repairs and improvements it needed. Ruby chose wallpaper and paint colors, ordered curtains and linens, and gradually transformed the empty structure into a welcoming second home. The ladies of Sweetwater Springs organized a household shower, providing the couple with handmade quilts, preserved foods, and practical items for their new life together. The townhouse was completed just a week before the wedding, allowing Ruby and Vaughn to furnish it with a combination of pieces from his ranch, items Ruby had brought from Philadelphia, and new purchases that reflected their shared taste. It feels like us, Ruby observed as they stood in the completed parlor, admiring how well their possessions complemented each other. A perfect blend of who we were and who were becoming together. Vaughn's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting atop her head. Like its owners, he agreed softly. Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, with a light dusting of fresh snow that made Sweetwater Springs look like a scene from a Christmas card. The ceremony was held in the town's small church, filled to capacity with what seemed like every resident of the county. Ruby wore a gown of ivory satin trimmed with lace, while Vaughn cut a handsome figure in a new black suit. Martha Jenkins, who had become like a mother to Ruby in the months since her arrival, escorted her down the aisle in the absence of her father and brothers. Tears glistened in the older woman's eyes as she placed Ruby's hand in Vaughn's before taking her seat in the front pew. The service was simple, but deeply moving. Ruby and Vaughn had written their own vows, each promising to honor the other's past while building a future filled with love and mutual respect. When Vaughn slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady, but his eyes shone with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared as the congregation broke into spontaneous applause. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Hollis." Vaughn's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, a fitting beginning to their married life. As they turned to face their friends and neighbors as husband and wife, Ruby felt a sense of rightness that confirmed every choice that had led her to this moment. The celebration continued at the town hall, transformed for the occasion with evergreen boughs, red ribbons, and dozens of candles. A feast prepared by the community's best cooks was laid out on long tables, and a small band played lively tunes for dancing. Ruby and Vaughn moved through the crowd, accepting congratulations and sharing their happiness with everyone who had welcomed Ruby so warmly to their community. As evening fell, they slipped away to their townhouse, where they would spend their first night as husband and wife before traveling to Denver for a brief honeymoon. Standing in the parlor they had furnished together, now aglow with lamplight and a crackling fire, they savored the first moments of privacy they had enjoyed all day. "Mrs. Hollis," Vaughn said softly, drawing Ruby into his arms. "My wife." "My husband," Ruby replied, still marveling at the rightness of those words. "It hardly seems possible that less than 6 months ago, I was a stranger stepping off the stage in a town I'd never seen before." "And now?" Vaughn asked, his fingers gently caressing her cheek. "Now I'm home," Ruby answered simply. "Wherever you are, that's my home." The tenderness in Vaughn's eyes deepened as he lowered his lips to hers, sealing their new beginning with a kiss that promised a lifetime of love, understanding, and shared dreams. Spring came early to Wyoming Territory in 1879, with March winds giving way to April sunshine that coaxed wildflowers from the warming earth. Ruby Hollis stood on the porch of the ranch house, a cup of coffee warming her hands as she watched her husband work with a young colt in the corral nearby. 6 months of marriage had only deepened her love for Vaughn, their life together falling into comfortable rhythms that suited them both. Ruby continued her work at the Sentinel 3 days a week, her column, Notes from a Newcomer, having become one of the paper's most popular features. The townhouse proved its worth during the winter months, providing a convenient base when weather made daily travel to the ranch impractical. But it was the ranch that had truly become home, the place where she and Vaughn built their life together, day by day. As promised, Ruby's brother Richard had visited in February, initially skeptical of his sister's hasty marriage, but quickly won over by Vaughn's evident devotion and Ruby's obvious happiness. He had returned to Philadelphia with assurances that their youngest brother James would accompany him on his next visit, perhaps for an extended stay. Ruby smiled as Vaughn looked up from his work, catching sight of her on the porch. He raised a hand in greeting, his face lighting with the smile he reserved just for her. Setting aside her coffee cup, Ruby made her way to the corral, enjoying the simple pleasure of walking across land that was now partly hers, heading toward the man who had made this place a true home. "Good morning, beautiful," Vaughn greeted her, leaning over the fence to steal a quick kiss. "Sleep well?" "Very well," Ruby replied, though in truth she had woken early, her mind filled with plans and possibilities. "The colt is looking more confident today." "He's learning quickly," Vaughn agreed, patting the young horse's neck. "Another week or two, and he'll be ready for a proper saddle." Ruby watched man and horse together, marveling at Vaughn's patience and gentle handling. Those same qualities had made him a wonderful husband, attentive, considerate, always willing to listen and compromise. "I was thinking," Ruby said, trying to keep her voice casual, "that perhaps we should consider adding a room to the house. For the future." Vaughn's hand stilled on the colt's halter. "A room?" Ruby met his questioning gaze steadily.
Yes.
"A nursery, perhaps? For around Christmas time." For a moment, Vaughn stood completely still, processing her words. Then his expression transformed with dawning understanding and joy. "Ruby," he breathed, vaulting over the fence in a single fluid movement to stand before her. "Are you saying?" Ruby nodded, tears of happiness welling in her eyes. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Vaughn." With a sound that was half laugh, half sob, Vaughn gathered her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. "A baby," he repeated, his voice filled with wonder. "Our baby." Ruby held him tightly, feeling his heart racing against hers. They had spoken of children, of course, both hoping to expand their family someday. But the reality of a new life created from their love was overwhelming in its beauty and significance. When Vaughn finally set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Are you feeling well? Do you need to rest more? I can take over your duties," Ruby laughed, placing her finger against his lips.
I'm perfectly fine.
"Dr. Miller says I'm in excellent health, and there's no need to change my routine yet, though perhaps in a few months, when the baby begins to show." Vaughn's hand moved reverently to rest against her still, flat abdomen. "Our child," he whispered. "I never thought I'd have this chance again." Ruby covered his hand with her own, understanding the complex emotions this news would bring for him. "Are you happy, truly?" "More than I can express," Vaughn assured her, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me back everything I thought was lost forever, Ruby. A family, a future, hope." They stood together in the morning sunlight, hands joined over the new life growing within Ruby, hearts full of dreams for the years ahead. From this single precious moment would flow countless others, the first flutter of movement, the first cry of their newborn, first steps, first words, a lifetime of love and growth and possibility. "I love you, Vaughn Hollis," Ruby said softly, reaching up to touch his beloved face. "Thank you for noticing a trespasser picking wildflowers in your field." Vaughn's smile was tender as he bent to kiss her. "They suited you just fine," he murmured against her lips. "Just as you suit me, my love. Just as you always will." As spring blossomed into summer around them, Ruby and Vaughn prepared for the new life that would join their family at year's end. The nursery addition to the ranch house took shape under Vaughn's careful direction, a bright, airy room adjoining their bedroom. Ruby sewed curtains from cheerful yellow fabric and began collecting the necessities for their child's arrival, while Vaughn crafted a cradle from pine wood, lovingly carving delicate patterns along its edges. Word of their expected blessing spread quickly through Sweetwater Springs, bringing congratulations and advice from every quarter. The ladies of the town organized a baby shower, presenting Ruby with handmade blankets, tiny garments, and practical items for the months ahead. Martha Jenkins appointed herself unofficial guardian of Ruby's health, ensuring she rested adequately and ate properly despite her determination to maintain her work at the newspaper until late in her pregnancy. As her body changed to accommodate their growing child, Ruby found herself marveling at the miracle taking place within her. Vaughn treated her with even greater tenderness, his eyes often following her with a mixture of pride and protective concern. When the baby's movements became strong enough for him to feel, he would spend evenings with his hand resting on her rounded abdomen, his expression one of wonder each time their child kicked or shifted. "Active little one," he observed one night as they sat together on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. "Takes after his mother, I think." "Or her father," Ruby countered with a smile. "Always in motion, always building something new." They had chosen not to guess the baby's gender, agreeing that the surprise would be part of the joy of birth. They had, however, discussed names Robert or James for a boy, after their fathers, Elizabeth and for a girl, honoring Vaughn's first wife while creating a connection between past and present. As autumn painted the landscape in vibrant hues, Ruby's column in the Sentinel became more reflective, touching on themes of continuity and change, legacy and new beginnings. Her readers responded warmly to these deeper explorations, and Howard Perkins suggested compiling her writings into a book that might appeal to a wider audience beyond their community. "People back east are fascinated by Western life," he explained when presenting the idea. "Your perspective as someone who's made that transition successfully could be valuable to others considering the same journey." Ruby was intrigued by the possibility, though she set aside serious work on such a project until after the baby's arrival. For now, her energies were focused on preparing for the child who would join their family as winter set in. December arrived with a blanket of snow that transformed the landscape into a glittering wonderland. As Christmas approached, Ruby's time was divided between the cozy townhouse, where they would spend the holiday season to be closer to the doctor, and final preparations at the ranch for their return with the baby after its birth. On Christmas Eve, Ruby and Vaughn attended the community celebration at the church, receiving well wishes from friends and neighbors. Ruby, now in her final weeks of pregnancy, moved slowly but radiated contentment as she sat beside her husband for the candlelight service. "You're the most beautiful woman in Wyoming territory," Vaughn whispered as they listened to the choir sing Silent Night. Ruby smiled, leaning against his strong shoulder. "I doubt that very much, given my current state. But I appreciate the sentiment." "I mean it," Vaughn insisted, his hand finding hers. "You've never been more beautiful to me than you are right now, carrying our child." The tenderness in his voice brought tears to Ruby's eyes, a common occurrence in these emotional final weeks. She squeezed his hand in silent reply, too moved for words. Later that night, as they lay in their bed in the townhouse, Ruby felt the first unfamiliar pains begin. Having read extensively about childbirth, she recognized the early signs of labor, but chose not to alarm Vaughn immediately. The contractions were mild and widely spaced, suggesting many hours remained before their child would arrive. By morning, however, there was no disguising the reality. As Vaughn prepared coffee in the kitchen, Ruby appeared in the doorway, one hand supporting her back, the other resting on her prominent belly. "Vaughn," she said calmly, "I think you should fetch Dr. Miller. Our Christmas gift appears to be arriving right on schedule." Vaughn nearly dropped the coffee pot, his eyes widening. "The baby? Now? Are you certain?" Ruby nodded, managing a smile despite her discomfort. "Quite certain. The pains began last night and have been growing stronger and more frequent." "Last night?" Vaughn exclaimed, setting down the pot with shaking hands. "Why didn't you tell me?" "There was nothing to be done then," Ruby explained reasonably. "And I wanted you to get your rest. You'll need your strength today, as much as I will." Vaughn crossed the room in 2 long strides, gathering her carefully into his arms. "My brave, practical wife," he murmured against her hair. "Always thinking of others." A contraction chose that moment to tighten across Ruby's abdomen, causing her to grip Vaughn's arms until it passed. "Perhaps we could continue this conversation after you've fetched the doctor," she suggested when she could speak again. The next hours passed in a blur of pain and determination for Ruby.
Dr.
Miller arrived promptly, his calm, professional manner reassuring both expectant parents. Martha Jenkins appeared soon after, having been alerted by Vaughn's hasty passage through town. Her practical experience with childbirth proved invaluable as the labor progressed throughout the day. Vaughn refused to leave Ruby's side, supporting her through each contraction, wiping her brow with cool cloths and murmuring encouragement when her strength seemed to flag. As daylight faded into evening, Ruby's labor intensified, her world narrowing to the overwhelming task of bringing their child into the world. "You're doing wonderfully," Dr. Miller assured her as he checked her progress. "The baby is in perfect position. Not much longer now." Ruby nodded wearily, gathering her remaining strength for the final effort. Vaughn's face was etched with concern as he held her hand, feeling helpless in the face of her pain, yet awed by her courage. "I love you," he told her, pressing a kiss to her damp forehead. "More than I ever thought possible." Ruby managed a tired smile. "Remember that when I'm keeping you awake with midnight feedings." The final stage of labor came swiftly after that, a series of powerful contractions that demanded everything Ruby had to give. With Vaughn supporting her shoulders and Martha holding her hand, she bore down with determination, focusing on the precious life struggling to enter the world. "I can see the head," Dr. Miller announced. "One more good push, Mrs. Hollis." With a cry that was part pain, part triumph, Ruby summoned her last reserves of strength. Moments later, a new sound filled the room, the indignant wail of a newborn taking its first breath. "A beautiful girl," Dr. Miller proclaimed, placing the tiny, squirming infant on Ruby's chest. "Born on Christmas Day." Tears streamed down Ruby's face as she gazed at her daughter, red-faced and perfect, with a dusting of dark hair that promised to match her father's. "Hello, little one," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "We've been waiting for you." Vaughn seemed unable to speak, his eyes fixed on the miraculous sight of his wife and newborn daughter. When he finally found his voice, it was rough with unshed tears. "She's perfect," he managed, reaching out to touch the baby's tiny hand with one gentle finger. "Just like her mother." "Elizabeth and Hollis," Ruby said softly, looking up at her husband for confirmation. Vaughn nodded, his throat working with emotion. "Beth," he added after a moment. "We'll call her Beth." In the quiet hours that followed, as Christmas Day gave way to evening, the new family of three settled into the peaceful rhythm of their first hours together. Martha and Dr. Miller departed after ensuring mother and child were resting comfortably, leaving Vaughn to watch over his wife and daughter as they slept. Sitting beside the bed, Vaughn marveled at the two precious lives entrusted to his care. His daughter's tiny face, still red and somewhat squashed from birth, nevertheless showed hints of the beauty she would grow into. Ruby's features, relaxed in exhausted sleep, bore the marks of her ordeal but also a profound serenity. As if sensing his gaze, Beth stirred in her swaddling, small fists waving as her face scrunched in preparation for a cry. Vaughn carefully lifted her from Ruby's side, cradling her against his chest as he had seen his wife do. "Hush now, little one," he murmured, moving to the rocking chair by the window. "Let your mama rest. She's worked very hard today to bring you to us." To his surprise, Beth quieted at the sound of his voice, her unfocused eyes seeming to search for his face. Vaughn felt his heart expand with a love so intense it was almost painful, a feeling both familiar and entirely new. This child was not a replacement for the daughter he had lost, but a new blessing, a testament to life's capacity for renewal and hope. "You are so loved, Beth Hollis," he whispered to his newborn daughter. "So very loved." Outside the window, snow began to fall again, large flakes drifting lazily in the light of the street lamps. Inside, the small family slept peacefully, their first Christmas together marking the beginning of a new chapter in their shared story. The years that followed brought challenges and joys in equal measure, as all lives do. Beth grew from a chubby-cheeked infant into a curious toddler with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. Ruby's column expanded into a successful book about Western life from an Eastern woman's perspective, bringing her recognition beyond Sweetwater Springs. Vaughn's ranch prospered, allowing them to improve both their properties and contribute generously to community projects. 2 years after Beth's birth, Ruby gave birth to their son, James Robert Hollis, a sturdy boy with his mother's chestnut hair and a serious expression that gave way to dazzling smiles for those he loved. The siblings were close from the start, Beth assuming the role of protective older sister with natural grace. On a warm summer afternoon in 1884, Ruby stood once again in the meadow where she had first met Vaughn, watching her children gather wildflowers under their father's watchful eye. At 38, Vaughn had a few strands of silver threading through his dark hair, but he moved with the same easy strength that had first attracted her attention. At 28, Ruby had grown into her role as wife, mother, and respected writer with confident assurance. "Mama, look," 5-year-old Beth called, running toward her with a bouquet of blue lupins and yellow black-eyed Susans. "I picked these for you. They're beautiful, sweetheart," Ruby replied, accepting the slightly crushed flowers with appropriate admiration. "Just like the ones I was picking when I first met your father." Beth's eyes widened with interest. She loved hearing the story of her parents' meeting. "When you were trespassing?" she asked, still struggling with the word. "Trespassing," Ruby corrected gently. "Yes, that's right. And Papa said they suit you just fine," Beth continued, quoting the familiar tale. "Suit, not soot," James piped up, eager to demonstrate his superior 3-year-old vocabulary. "Right, Papa?" Vaughn approached with his son perched on his shoulders, the boy's small hands gripping his father's hair for balance. "That's right, James. I said the flowers suited your mama just fine." His eyes met Ruby's over their children's heads, still filled with the same warmth and love that had drawn her to him from the beginning. "And then you got married and had us," Beth concluded triumphantly, as though their existence was the obvious and perfect conclusion to the story. "Eventually," Vaughn agreed with a smile. "But there was quite a bit that happened in between." "Like what?" James demanded, always hungry for new details. Ruby laughed, reaching up to ruffle her son's hair. "Those are stories for when you're older. For now, I think we should head back to the house. Martha and Howard will be arriving for dinner soon." As they walked together toward the ranch house, Vaughn's free hand found Ruby's, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of years shared. Their children ran ahead, Beth leading James in an improvised game that involved much spinning and falling dramatically into the grass. "Happy?" Vaughn asked quietly, a question he still posed occasionally, as though marveling at their good fortune. Ruby squeezed his hand, her heart full as she surveyed the life they had built together, the thriving ranch, their beautiful children, the deep and abiding love that had grown stronger with each passing year. "Completely," she replied, standing on tiptoe to kiss his cheek. "Those wildflowers led me to everything I never knew I wanted, and everything I'll always need." Vaughn's smile was tender as he gazed down at the woman who had brought such unexpected joy into his life. "They suited you just fine," he murmured, echoing the words that had begun their story. "And you, Ruby Hollis, have suited me perfectly from the very start,"